Yes, look, I want to speak to my amendment there, number 111, and this comes back to an issue that we discussed last week in terms of biogenic methane. And again, I want to state that I'm not looking at that agriculture should be given a free pass in relation to this legislation. But what I am looking for is that there would be a separate and distinct target for biogenic methane. And as I said last week, I'm not making reference to the issue of nitrous oxide, but specifically to biogenic methane. And look, I think substantial progress can be made in terms of agriculture, particularly in terms of land use, which Deputy Sean Sherlock spoke about earlier on. But the reality is that the first deadline in terms of emissions reductions that we have now is 233 weeks away. And I believe that the only way that we can achieve significant reductions in that period of time across the agricultural sector that will have a real impact is in terms of herd reduction. We've already seen at the weekend the Minister for Agriculture making the point that there will be a freeze on the herd numbers in the dairy sector, which implicitly means that there will be a reduction in the beef sector, and that would be of huge concern, particularly on marginal land where there is no other farming practice that can manage that land and provide for the variation of biodiversity that we spoke about earlier this morning. And I think the issue of biogenic methane, which is clearly reflected in EU policy, which was reflected by Minister Ryan and former Minister Bruton in their contributions last week, which is enshrined in legislation in New Zealand, who is the other country with a very similar climate profile to Ireland. And I believe insufficient recognition is being given here to the issue of biogenic methane. And maybe the Minister in his response will come back again in the issue of definitions. While there's reference made to biogenic methane, there is no specific definition outlined. And as you know, the Climate Change Advisory Council has explicitly said that there should be a very clear definition for what is biogenic methane, and that it should be accounted for separately in terms of our emissions target. And actually, it goes on to say, the Climate Change Advisory Council go on to say that at EU level, that we should be arguing and that there's a valid argument to have a separate target for biogenic methane. Now, it's very hard to have an EU-wide target in terms of biogenic methane when we are not prepared to differentiate against that here within our own legislation. And the reality is, whether we like it or not, and I know people aren't publicly admitting to this, but at present, and the Climate Change Advisory Council have said this as well, there is no means available at scale to reduce enteric methane emissions without reducing the livestock numbers. And I think we do need to be clear in relation to that. Otherwise, I think we do need to ensure that there is a separate individual target for biogenic methane. Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy Minister.
Thank you, Deputy Naughten, for your amendment. So the first thing I want to address is the definition question. How are we going to define, the impact of biogenic methane in particular? And previously the deputy was referring to carbon leakage, and as I said, addressing something like carbon leakage requires international cooperation. And to have that international cooperation, even before you start reducing emissions, you need definitions and you need metrics and you need measurements. And that's why you need a common measurement for all of these things. You need a common measurement for an agreed common measurement for the impact of every greenhouse gas, including methane. So we will be using, in terms of definition, we will be using the agreed definitions from the UN and the EU, from other international relevant bodies, so that we can do work and cooperate and collaborate with other countries, which we have to do because we're sharing an atmosphere. The question about will it be treated differently and will it have a separate, will it have a separate budget and so on, it will be examined, and it is the responsibility of the Climate Change Advisory Committee to consider the effect of each greenhouse gas. And the bill does provide that when proposing the carbon budgets, that the Climate Change Advisory Council will take account of the best scientific advice, including the special characteristics of biogenic methane, the most recent greenhouse gas inventory and projection reports, international best practice, and the reporting of greenhouse gas emissions and removals so far as practicable, and the need to maximise employment, the attractiveness of the state for investment, and the long-term competitiveness of the economy, and also having regard to the principle of climate justice. So that's the guidance to the CCAC, to the Climate Change Advisory Council. Just to say in general that the agricultural sector is different from the other sectors in that it does have the possibility of negative emissions of carbon sinks and of approaches that involve biodiversity or bog rewetting or other activities. So agriculture is distinctly different from the others in the fact that it has that possibility of reducing emissions and storing emissions and sequestering emissions that other sectors don't have. So the answer in short is that I'm opposing the amendment on the basis that it's not needed, and that the Climate Change Advisory Council is going to examine the special characteristics of biogenic methane and all other greenhouse gases and what their separate impact is. Thank you.
Just to come back briefly and to pick up from where Richard Bruton left off, and I agree 100% with what Richard Bruton has said, and that is, and the problem here, Minister, is, and this is my fundamental issue with this legislation. I agree with the principle of the legislation, but my fundamental difficulty here is we do not know how all of this is going to be measured, even though we're now enacting the legislation. We're setting the target for 2030, but we just don't know how it's going to be measured over that period of time. And Richard Bruton is correct in terms of carbon sequestration. It's left out of the European inventory, which is hugely frustrating. And you're right, negotiations are going on at the moment, which will decide how all of this is being reconciled. And absolutely, we have to be far more ambitious. But we're now setting in stone targets without actually knowing how we're actually going to measure those. Now, the Climate Change Advisory Council has specifically highlighted this particular challenge. And under the UN climate mechanism and the EU reporting structures, agricultural emissions are calculated separately from the removals and sequestration associated with land use. Now, Minister, you have very well put the point across a couple of minutes ago in response to me initially, that the opportunity is there within agriculture to sequester carbon. But the difficulty is none of us know how that is going to be measured in an Irish context. We don't know how it's going to be measured in a European context, because it's not measured at the moment, or at an international context. So on one hand, we're setting overall targets, but we don't know what are the rules actually going to be to actually achieve those targets. And what I'm trying to do in terms of my amendments is it's specifically to separate out that target in terms of agriculture. Yes, absolutely, we have to have a plus and minus, and you're right, agriculture is very unique in that there is the plus and minus there. There's absolutely no doubt about it. I think all of us agree that land use and land use change are fundamentally important to where we're going to be in agriculture in 2030. But yet, the progress that's made in transport or lack thereof, the progress that's made in heating or lack thereof, will have a direct impact in what we can and cannot do and how things are counted in agriculture. And that, I think, is a fundamental weakness in this legislation. Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy Minister. Do you wish to respond?
I'm not sure what I can say without repetition. Certainly our bill is about net emissions, so you do get credit for sequestering carbon, and we will be, the legislation that we make will at some point have to align with European legislation and achieve the same goals, and we'll be working to do that. But we're not going to wait for Europe to legislate first. We're going to move ahead as quickly as we can. And even if it takes all night, we're going to keep going until we can get this legislation passed, and we can get our first carbon budget done this year, and we can get working on this. So, and certainly, obviously, agriculture has a unique position in Ireland, and I'm glad to hear Deputy Naughten saying that there is opportunity here as well as danger, and that this isn't just a time for people to feel frightened. It's a time for agriculture to pivot and to become stronger, and to see its role in protecting the environment and in sequestering and saving emissions as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Chair, just before you move on there,
Naughten, go ahead.
117 is grouped with 125, which is my amendment, and I wish to speak to that.
Okay. We will take. It is grouped, so we will take amendments 118 and 121 through to 140. They're all related, so we're taking all those together. Okay.
Yeah, look, Chair, I'll be very brief in relation to this particular amendment. And the amendment that I've put down here is that the second carbon budget would actually be formally presented to the Oireachtas. So as the legislation is drafted at present, the first carbon budget and the draft third carbon budget are presented, and the Oireachtas has the opportunity to either accept those two budgets or reject them, and if they reject them, then the minister can, within 60 days, bring in whatever budget he or she likes. Now, that broader issue is something that we'll come back to, or that we have discussed already, and we'll come back to. I'm not going to deal with that. But the issue here is that the second budget isn't formally put before the Oireachtas other than in this particular piece of legislation. Now, some would argue that, well, look, the Oireachtas is deciding on that now because it's deciding on the legislation here, and that may very well be the case. I'm sure that's the argument that the minister will put forward. But the point I'm making is that it's not good parliamentary practice that you would introduce a budget, whether it's financial or otherwise, without having a formal ratification process by Parliament. Every year, the Minister for Finance must present his budget or her budget to the House for approval. The National Development Plan must be presented for approval. The National Planning Framework must be presented for approval. However, the 2030 carbon budget will not actually formally be presented to the Oireachtas for approval, and I believe that it should. I'm not going to dwell on the issue, but I think that it is good parliamentary practice that each budget should formally be presented and laid before the House and actually discussed and debated. Thank you.
Thank you, Deputies, Committee members. I accepted these amendments are in good faith and so on, but I'm going to argue against them. So what we're doing at the moment is the Oireachtas is getting its chance to decide, does it want to carry out these ambitious emission reductions over the coming decade? And it is setting in place a process by which we can achieve that. And there are checks and balances along the way as we decide how it's done. We have our Climate Change Advisory Committee, we have Oireachtas committees where you can bring in ministers and cross-examine them on their actions. But the question is, I guess the question from these amendments is whether the houses of the Oireachtas should be allowed to stop the carbon budgets from going through. And the danger that we have if we allow this to happen is that we enter into a recurring cycle of carbon budgets. So in other words, a compromised and collective agreement. If a compromised and collective agreement can be reached on a budget by the houses, that's fine. But if they keep being rejected, then there is no reason that any carbon budget can then be put through, and then we're left in a sort of a situation of where we have nothing to work with. So we have agreed we have agreed what the emission reduction is going to be. So when the carbon budget is presented to the House, they do have an opportunity to reject it and to ask for it to be reconsidered. But we can't allow that to be a sort of infinite power. So you know, I think there's an idea underlying these amendments that this is undemocratic, and this is simply untrue. The process provides opportunity for the Houses to input into the carbon budget in the first 2-month period on the publication of the Climate Change Advisory Council budget, but also to vote on the budget as presented. And so there is plenty of time for debate. And I strongly disagree with the proposal, and I think that the government should be the final approving authority, but that the government should then be held accountable by the Oireachtas for its approved budgets. I think that if we were to delegate approval to the House as a whole, that would undercut the role of the executive to the detriment of accountability. So, you know, who is the Oireachtas going to cross-examine and hold accountable if they've made the decisions themselves? So I'm calling on the amendment to be withdrawn.
Thanks very much, Chair. First of all, can I thank the Minister for his frankness and his honesty in relation to his response, which I think is refreshing in relation to this, because we haven't heard this from anyone else to date. And, you know, the Minister says that there are checks and balances along the way. There is absolutely a mechanism where the Oireachtas is engaged with, and that is already in place in the 2015 legislation, which we all accept is inadequate. And yet, you know, the Minister is basically regurgitating the engagement with the Oireachtas in terms of the 2015 legislation, but the approval and ratification process is now being taken out of the hands of the National Parliament and put in the hands of the government. And the Minister said in his response that the government should be the final approval process. No, it shouldn't, Minister. It should not be the final approval process. The National Parliament should be the final approval process. If we were to replicate what you're just arguing in terms of public finances, you would have the Minister for Finance in the first budget after an election cycle, presenting all of the taxation measures for the next 5 years, what taxes are going to be introduced, how they're going to apply to every individual across the country, without actually saying how they're actually going to spend any of that money over the 5 years. And if Dáil Éireann rejects that budget that is presented by the Minister for Finance, then the Minister for Finance can bring in any taxation measure he or she wants within 60 days without any recourse to Parliament. Now, that is an unbelievable power that we are giving to any minister and to any government. And what we are doing in this legislation, in terms of the carbon budget and in terms of the sectoral target plans, which I think is even worse. At least there is some mechanism here of some, you know, veil of some type of approval process here. There's none in relation to the sectoral targets, but in relation to the overall carbon budget, the Oireachtas is the choice. It either accepts it or leaves it to the Minister of the day to bring in whatever budget they so wish. And that is just completely unacceptable in any democracy. And I gave an analogy during the second stage of this legislation. I think the powers that we are given here are far excessive that we're giving to any one individual or any government of the day. Ultimately, we as TDs are the ones who are accountable to the people. And anyone who accepts the legislation as it is currently drafted is basically writing themselves out of any formal and legal input into either the carbon budgets or the sectoral targets from here forward. And I think that's fundamentally wrong. And I would urge you, Minister, to reconsider this between now and report stage. I think you'll agree, Minister, the vast majority of members in the Oireachtas are in support of moving forward in a very positive way in achieving our overall climate targets, not just to 2030, but beyond that to 2050. But let's say down the road, Minister, you have a minister and a government who are not ambitious in relation to this. And they put forward very inadequate carbon budgets while they take cognizance of what the Climate Change Advisory Council say. They listen to what the committee says. Ultimately, they set very minimal targets. The Parliament that is elected by the people has no function if it rejects that budget because they believe that it's insufficient to meet our global challenges and our domestic challenges. Then the minister of the day can bring in whatever budget they so wish. And I think that is completely unacceptable. So I would ask you and urge you to reconsider this amendment.
Thank you, Deputy.
Thank you for your contributions, deputies. So the line that's drawn between what is an executive action and what is an action for the Oireachtas, as legislators, you decide that, and that's part of what's happening as drawing up this bill. So what this bill does is that it sets a target. It sets a very clear target, and as Deputy Naughten said, the 2015 Act was inadequate, and this is trying to address that. And I welcome the fact that we're all trying to achieve the same thing here. So, by setting that target, that is the strategy, that is the objective that has to be achieved. What then happens is that the executive is the operational body that has to carry out the actions to achieve that target. And it's not for the Oireachtas at that point then to intervene in the executive actions. There's a reason why you have an executive, and there's a reason why you have a legislature. There are two different bodies, and they each have different functions. The Deputy Naughten referred to the case where in a hypothetical future, a minister arrives who has a very low degree of ambition and brings a carbon budget along that's not going to achieve anything, or that he's opposed to the whole idea of climate action. What would happen in that case, and how could the Oireachtas stop them? So that's what this law does. That is what this bill is doing. It brings in a requirement for the ministers, for the government, to comply with international obligations and to meet that 51% target. And also, it's justiciable. It is something that you can go to court on if they're not performing their obligations that they're required to do under the bill. So those are the two levers, and in fact we're strengthened in our position than we would be. Of course, it's always open to a future Dáil to amend the legislation or to repeal it. At the end of the day, the Oireachtas is the body that makes those decisions. But the executive has to be allowed to perform the actions once the targets have been set, and we are setting targets in this legislation for once, and we are setting that 51% reduction. That every 5 years a carbon budget will be set, and we're looking at it's a long-term process. So it's not like an annual financial budget where you're looking at how much money is going to be spent in a few months' time. This is a long-term objective, a 5-year carbon budget, a 10-year target to reach 2030, and then the longer-term target to reach 2050. So I feel it has the right balance between the executive powers and the powers of the Oireachtas, and I think that it does mean that the government and the ministers will have to perform the actions that they're duty bound to by this legislation.
Minister.
Yeah, just Chair, to come back in response to the Minister. And yes, the Minister is correct and accurate to say that the Executive are responsible for operational actions, and I'm not disputing that. But setting the overall budget on a 5-year basis and setting sectoral targets are not operational actions. They are matters of policy, and they should be agreed and ratified
Deputy.
by...
Deputy, I apologise for interrupting. It turns out the Minister hasn't made his way back yet.
Right.
So I'll suspend briefly and
That's perfect.
I'm sure he'll be back in a moment. Thank you.
Is that the executive are responsible for operational actions, and I don't dispute that point with the Minister at all. But setting an overall budget on a 5-year basis in terms of our overall carbon emissions, setting the sectoral targets are not operational actions, and they cannot be considered as such. They should be ratified and approved by Dáil Éireann. And there should not, under any circumstance, be a gun placed to the head of the members of Dáil Éireann that if they don't ratify this, you hand the power directly over to the Minister of the Day to set whatever targets he or she wishes. They should have to come back. If they're rejected, they should have to come back before the Dáil and be approved by the Dáil. This is the democratically elected Parliament of this country. And you cannot get away from that. And the Minister's defence to say, well, you can actually go to court and force the government to do something. The judiciary and the legislature are two very separate and distinct arms of government. So for the government and the minister to be saying, well, look, if people aren't happy with this, they should toddle off to the steps of the four courts, is not good enough. The people that are accountable in relation to this are the 160 TDs that are elected in every single constituency across the country. They should be able to justify and explain why they're taking an approach, and that approach should have to be approved by the majority of the elected members of Parliament. Now, we have said all along, and I firmly believe this, I know some people pay lip service to it, but I firmly believe that if we are going to achieve our targets, whether they be for 2030 or 2050, we can only do that by bringing people along with us along that road. And to legislate the Dáil out of existence in terms of approval or rejection of the overall budgets and the sectoral targets, I think will undermine that particular principle. And this is one principle that I'm not prepared to bend on, Minister. I believe that it is a fundamental aspect of this legislation that the Dáil should be the body on a 5-year basis that would approve the budget. Your colleagues, Minister, during the last Dáil made the argument that the planning framework should be approved by the Dáil, that the National Development Plan should be approved by the Dáil, and that these shouldn't be left just to the executive. Now, at least with each of those objectives, they must come on an annual basis before the Dáil through the budget process, both in terms of the budget vote itself and then the estimates for each government department. But these sectoral targets are not going to be ratified by the parliamentary committees, will not be presented to the Dáil for ratification whatsoever. And the only function and role that we have is on a once-off basis, once every 5 years, to accept or hand the power back to the minister. And I don't believe that that's good enough. I think it's wrong. It's bad for democracy, and it's bad for our overall aim of bringing people along this climate journey with us. Thank you.
Thank you, Deb.
So I guess the goal of the legislation is to create a process that isn't easy to dismantle on a whim, either by the executive or by the Oireachtas. Of course it's possible, and of course it's possible to repeal it or to amend it, and the Oireachtas, of course, always retains that power. And the Dáil can reject the carbon budget if they don't like it. And there is going to be public consultation not just on the climate action plan, but also on the carbon budgets. And the legislation does provide for not just a public consultation, but for an ongoing regular engagement and dialogue on the climate action on the climate actions that are in the climate action plan. The ministers, of course, will be accountable to the committees for to see that they're carrying out what they're supposed to do, and all of this has been designed and engineered, as Deputy Bruton said, to be justiciable. So I think we have a lot of levels there. We have a lot of safeguards, and overall, the basic proposition is that we are setting an emission reductions target for 2030, and that the Dáil has to decide, and the Seanad has to decide between them: is this a target that we want to achieve? Is this what our ambition is on a large scale? This is what our strategy is. And if this is a strategy we want to achieve, then allow the executive to come up with an action plan that allows that objective to be met, and make sure that action plan is acceptable to the public, that it brings people with them, that there is real engagement, because it can't work without people believing and knowing that this is a fair plan, and that this is a plan where they've been listened to, and that it makes sense, and that everybody has been brought in. So really, that's what our goal is, and I don't think it would help to remove the power of the executive to implement it, or to move that to the Oireachtas. I think the Oireachtas is getting the power now to decide if they want to have that 51% reduction, if they want to reach that 2050 net zero target. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. I'm conscious that we've had very extensive, although very enlightening discussion on these amendments, and I will bring in Deputies Naughten and O'Rourke, but I would ask that perhaps if you could be succinct and make your points if they are new points, and avoid repetition, and we will do our best to move on then. I'll bring in Deputy Naughten.
Yeah, just Chair, briefly, just responding to Richard Bruton and the Minister there. Absolutely, Richard, you're right. We are being told that we need to listen to the science. We do need to hold ministers accountable. And this legislation does provide for that. I'm not disputing that. And at the outset, I said, this is an important piece of legislation. I don't disagree with the principle of it. But science isn't black and white. And evidence changes. And, if we take the phrase Climate Change Advisory Council out of this debate, and we put in the National Public Health Emergency Team into the debate, there's a very different view around the houses of the Oireachtas today in terms of the black and white advice that has been given by NPHET over the last 12 months. And yet we are now enshrining in law a particular perspective on scientific advice that will set in stone between now and 2050. And the Parliament, the members of Parliament, have only got, the only decision they have is to accept whatever is presented by the Minister. If they don't accept what is presented by the Minister today then has a blank cheque to bring in whatever targets, which may have no bearing on what their original proposal is. So yes, we do need to listen to the science, but ultimately we are the ones that are accountable to the people. We have to explain and defend why we're taking this approach. Just like every single one of the 160 TDs that voted in the Dáil last week had to do in terms of the extension of the health provisions. Every one of us were held accountable to our constituents across the country. Why did we take a particular approach in relation to that? However, if this legislation is enacted as it is currently drafted, that mechanism is no longer available to the electorate, and I think that's wrong. And look, this is a fundamental difference in approaches from the Minister and Richard Bruton, and I know members of the committee and the view that I have, but I think it's a wrong approach to legislate the Dáil out of existence in relation to this. And that's my final word on it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Deputy Naughten makes a comparison between NPHET and the Climate Change Advisory Council, which is, I think, useful and interesting to think about. So, in the same way that NPHET is not sovereign, and neither will the Climate Change Advisory Council have some kind of divine authority the government has the final say, and it is it's an advisory group, and they give their advice, using the best economic and scientific and everything else knowledge that they have. They give that to the government, and the government then takes that on board. So that's really the comparison. I think obviously they're not exactly the same, and NEFIT is dealing with very new and emerging science. So they're looking at papers that were published last week on a disease that has emerged last year, rather than clearly the climate science is more mature than that. So you're not in quite the same short time frames. You don't have it. It is an emergency. There is an urgency to it. So I think it's a valid comparison. But I don't think you can say that the Climate Change Advisory Council will have some kind of great authority over the government. It's the other way around. They are an advisory group. Thank you.